Welcome everybody to our virtual author visit tonight. We're going to give everyone just a few minutes to come in as Zoom lets everybody who is waiting for the start come in, and we are right at 5:30, so give people just a minute or two in case there are some technical issues. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. If this is your first virtual author visit with us, welcome. If you have been taking part in this series over the last 2 years, welcome back. We're excited to have you here. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Kathryn. I have the great good fortune to be the director of the Lincoln Public Library. And in just a minute, I'll give everybody just one more minute to trickle in. I will start with my housekeeping spiel of what you can expect over the course of the next hour. But it's going to be a really fun time, and I'm glad to have you all here. All right, well, and just so everybody knows what's coming up, so this is one of our virtual author visits. So Tara and I are going to have a conversation for a little bit about her work, including her fantastic new publication, No Beauties or Monsters. Oh no, I have the Zoom blur screen. No Beauties or Monsters. We're also going to have time at the end for question and answer. So if you do have any questions that you would like to have asked, please drop them into the question and answer box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That's where we're going to be keeping track of the questions. It also lets us mark them off when they've been answered. You can drop those questions in at any time during the conversation. So as soon as you think of that question, go ahead and drop it into the Q&A. And then towards the end, we'll go through all of those questions. For any of you who aren't finding that question and answer box or calling in by phone, we will have a little bit of time after we do the question and answer box in case anyone has a question to call in via phone. But most of them are going to go through that Q&A box. If you're familiar with Zoom, you also know that there is that chat feature. You can feel free to use that. If you're from outside the Lincoln or Sacramento area, you can share where you're joining from, something to say hi, but we're not going to be following that chat room to get your questions nearly as closely as the question and answer. So Q&A for questions, we'll do that at the end. And then in very exciting news, thanks to the generosity of the Friends of the Lincoln Public Library, we do have 2 copies of the book we'll be talking about today that we will be giving away to attendees at the end of the event. So perks for joining: if you've already read it, already own a copy, hand it off to somebody you think would love it. If you haven't, it will be your chance to read this fantastic, slightly eerie tale that we're going to talk about. And so with that, I am very excited to welcome Tara Goedjen, correct?
Right.
Okay, close enough, if not correct. Tara Goedjen, who is the author of The Breathless and also No Beauties or Monsters, which was published only at the end of last year. She's been writing eerie and dark and spooky tales for quite a while. I think you mentioned that your first one you wrote at age 10. Got some kids disappearing. And has lived around the world in a number of places, grew up mostly in Alabama, and is writing and has done a number of other jobs. I know, a university professor, tennis coach, a couple other opportunities.
Editor at a publishing house. Yeah, lots of little jobs here and there.
Oh, very nice. So you've seen both sides of the publishing world,
yeah,
as a writer and an editor. Oh, that'll be fun to talk about it a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, Kathryn.
So as we mentioned, No Beauties or Monsters is your newest publication. I see you have the beautiful cover art behind you. And I think we'll start talking about that a little bit, but for any of our viewers who haven't had a chance to read the book, who are kind of joining us to find out if it's something that they're really excited about, can you summarize the plot a little bit without giving away the twists?
Sure. Well, so it's an atmospheric mystery. It has a little bit of a speculative bent to it, kind of like Stranger Things. And it's really about one desert town with a lot of disappearances and one teenager who goes in search of her missing friend. So it starts off with 17-year-old Riley. She's moving from San Diego to this sort of remote community in California's Mojave Desert near Joshua Tree National Park. And Riley doesn't want to move with her family because she's in high school. She doesn't want to leave her friends behind, but she's also been to the desert before. Her grandfather lived there. And so she's visited, doesn't have the best memories of the place. So she's kind of hesitant to be going, and she should be, because when she shows up, strange things start to happen in the desert. And that's when she finds out that one of her old friends has disappeared on a hiking trip. So that's kind of where the story kind of catapults into larger mysteries.
And so it seems like, as you're describing that this atmosphere, you say atmospheric mystery, talking about the desert, but that the landscape of the Mojave Desert and this sense of the desert as a place is really important. Would you say that that's true, that that's a really kind of hinge point for your novel?
Absolutely. I think sort of with both of my books, I really draw from landscape and sort of the history or the legends and lore around it. And so that definitely informed the book. And it was sort of the jumping off point for me. Just when I was living in California, I took a road trip out to the Mojave and just was so blown away by how surreal it looked, when you're not from there. It's just very striking. And I knew it would be just a wonderful setting for a thriller, especially sort of this life and death thriller with high stakes, because the climate is so extreme.
Absolutely. And if you've not been to Joshua Tree before, there's nothing quite like Joshua Tree. So when you hit that edge on the Mojave, they're very uncanny silhouettes. They have an almost human-like sense to them, but yeah, it's a very iconic landscape.
Yes, I agree. And you're lucky to be in California, so you can go anytime.
So you mentioned too, in terms of setting, that figures in your first book, The Breathless, but that's a very different setting for that book, correct?
Yes, it's in the South, so it's very humid and sort of almost, it's actually a really contained book, right? It's kind of about one family in one house, and you have that humidity of the South, so you're practically drowning in it. It's very swampy setting, very claustrophobic. So it's actually maybe the opposite of the expansive sort of otherworldly stretch of desert in Joshua Tree.
Did you find in trying to write, transitioning in your writing between those two landscapes, that the process of writing it was very different because the landscapes are so different? Or was the process of trying to build a really kind of evocative, eerie landscape that informs the story similar, even though kind of the details were different?
I mean, I would say it's similar in that, when you're dealing with those sort of atmospheric stories and mysteries, you're really working with that sense of place and with sort of the eeriness that goes into that. Is what we're seeing real, or is it imagined? What is this sort of in-between space, and what's really going on here? I mean, I think that sense of eeriness is the same, even though it's informed by different things depending on the landscape and the history of the place.
That's fascinating. And now I know history for the place is a big part of the research and prep work you did, and that you found some really interesting local folklore about Mojave and that area. Are there any tidbits of that are really exciting that maybe did, maybe didn't make it fully into the book, but that were interesting to you?
Yes, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that when I initially conceived of the idea, obviously it was sort of building off of this road trip that I did. And then I started researching the area and reading these local stories and sort of, all of the folklore tied to that. And, normally when you think of the American deserts or, modern myths, you think of Roswell, New Mexico, or Area 51 in Nevada. And so the Mojave Desert definitely has those stories, those sort of UFO sightings and those type of stories tied to it. And I was interested by that, but there were so many other legends as well, like, folklore around Bigfoot and, sand caverns that you could fall into and then discover gold and mummies and it was just, there's so much that was intriguing to me. And even those particular legends didn't make it into the story. I think the eeriness of them did. And I think that the reason why maybe there are so many stories out there is because the landscape itself is just so remote and isolating that you can see how it could start to sort of do things to your head and sort of make you question what's really out there, right? And I think when you're in those remote places where you can see the sky and you just realize how small you are and like how big the world is and how much you don't know about it. I think that's what I found most interesting. And that's sort of the atmosphere that went into No Beauties for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that discussion of how landscape affects, well, what we know and what we think to be real. And you mentioned this in another answer as well. This idea of, is what's happening real, or is it in our heads? Are we understanding things correctly? And I think that's really interesting too with the story you were writing, because Riley, who's at the heart of the story, is an unreliable narrator. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the process of writing, because I think with all you've been saying in the book, that this central to some of the stories that you're telling of with an unreliable narrator, where's the tension between what's real and what isn't, what the character knows or feels to be real and what, objectively within the world of the story is. And then you are writing for an audience between what you're letting us know and what you're holding back, so that we don't know the twist at that point, but we're still guessing, and how you kind of thread all of those together in your stories.
Yes, there's a lot to that. And so I think if we're talking about like what characters know and what they don't know and how you're balancing that in a mystery. I mean, the heart of No Beauties or Monsters, the mystery at the heart of it is like what happened to Riley's friend and why have so many people disappeared in the same location. So every chapter, Riley's sort of trying to figure this out. And, every chapter is sort of raising a new question because it's a mystery and you have to sustain it for the whole book. But to balance that out with like what the reader knows and what the characters knows, I also tried to make sure that there was an answer, at least a partial answer for every chapter as well, so that you had this sort of trail of breadcrumbs leading to the ending and the reveals at the ending. And you mentioned twists because there is that speculative layer to the book. When I think about really good twists, twists that kind of like stayed with me and made lasting impressions on me. I'm thinking of some movies that came out when I was younger. Most everyone's probably seen them, The Sixth Sense or The Usual Suspects, although they're old, so maybe people haven't seen them. But, I just remember being young and watching these movies and just all of a sudden, because they're movies, you get to the end and they're able to show you this montage of sort of like clues and this, these flashbacks of these moments that you've seen the whole time. And it's only now that you're seeing the big picture and it just changes, it completely flips everything you thought to be true. And I love when stories like make you re-examine what you think along the way. And that's really what I was trying to do with No Beauties or Monsters. But to succeed at that, I think you really do have to make sure that every clue is pointing at those, every clue is relevant. So like Riley is missing chunks of time and the things that she notices in the landscape and the strange cabin that she encounters, like all of these things are important to those twists at the end.
Absolutely. I love what you said about, I know those movies as well. And almost this idea of breadcrumbs working in two directions, because of course you're following your breadcrumbs to the end. But I agree, there's this fantastic thing when there's a really nice turn in a story that you almost follow them back out with this new understanding of how things were actually working, even though you didn't know it at the time when you first read it.
Yes, but it's all there. And you're right, like they can have layers to them. So they can like be misdirections, but also actually clues in the right direction too at the same time. It's kind of fun.
Absolutely. So continuing to talk about Riley a little bit, some of the big themes that I feel are in this is, Riley spends a lot of time with legacy and with memory. There's all these questions of missing time, but also her grandfather being in the desert, her memories there, and the work that he's doing in terms of trying to put this local history together. And Riley's wrestling with that, trying to find those things, then also trying to figure out, she is a fantastic young adult protagonist, who she is in the wake of those. Um, you find really fertile ground in this with kind of identity in the space of this atmospheric mystery and in this space for young adult publishing. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what's so interesting about that to you and how that's kind of informed this book.
Sure. And first of all, thank you for saying that. I pulled it off. But I think if I maybe speak specifically first to the story and then more broadly about sort of why YA and why we see questions of identity so often in YA writing. With No Beauties, like, you're right. Like she's discovering things about her family. Her family's been in this location before, so there's a family cabin, and she's kind of finding things out about her grandfather, and the secrets sort of with him and her family are calling into question everyone she knows, her family, her friends, and she's wondering if she can trust them. She's wondering if she can trust herself and what she's capable of. And I think that's why, we see questions of identity happening so much in thrillers, is like we have these moments where we're put into life and death situations. And in that moment, like, what would you do to protect someone you love? And how brave are you? How would you respond in these? So as a reader, we're sort of like getting to test ourselves and our own identity without actually having to experience what the characters are experiencing. And so when I'm writing these scenes, or even just when I'm reading another thriller, I'm always asking myself, like, well, what would I really do, right? There's a moment in No Beauties, for example, like where Riley is heading down this dark stairwell alone to this basement-like area, and she has a reason to be afraid of it. And I'm like, would I have continued, or would I have waited for a friend? I think I would have waited for a friend. And those actions are what sort of shape us and prove, who we are. So yeah, I think we see this a lot, these questions of identity, a lot in thrillers, because we have these big moments where we're forced to make these actions that define us. But also in young adult thrillers, we see questions of identity, I think, because, even though we're always discovering more and more about ourselves every day that we live, when you're a teenager, it's the first time sort of you're in between, right? You're in between childhood and adulthood. It's the first time you're sort of finding your footing. And figuring out who you are and who you want to be. So yeah, I think that's why we see that a lot.
I like that. And I think it's also interesting with yours, there's these family elements. And I think that can also be really profound for a lot of people, either who are young adults or thinking back to their adolescence, because it is also not just when we're discovering ourselves, but we're kind of the first time figuring out all the adults in our lives are people just like us, which means they've not all acted perfectly or been totally forthright through our entire childhood. That, our families are more complicated than we might have known when we were younger.
Yes. I mean, I think for me, there was definitely a shift, like, when you're thinking, oh, that adult has it all figured out, and one day I will too. And then you get to that age and you're like, wait, no, they're winging it.
And it's like, okay, yeah, this is as adult as I get. Okay. It's as adult as any of us get. And we just do more things.
Yeah, that's right. Be busier.
So you talk a little bit with that about how, stories let us try on identities or try on situations to see how we would hold on or hold up to those situations. Another big theme that kind of runs through your work in this is disappearances and loss, and kind of trying to bridge that. Do you think that works functionally, or is that one of the things that you find interesting with these, is trying to kind of try on those situations, or is there something else with kind of loss and trying to bridge that is really fertile ground for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's something I'll probably continue to think about. Like, why do I return to these subjects? And inevitably, as we go through life, we all experience some form of loss, and the longing that goes with that. So it's this universal emotion that you're, when you're talking about these subjects, that you're sort of tapping into. And so I think everyone knows what it feels like, no matter how old you are. Everybody knows what it feels like to want things to have turned out differently. And I guess I'm interested in what happens after you experience a life-changing event, like what that means for you, and sort of how you find the strength to get through it. So, you know, with thrillers, obviously they tend to be like, involve life and death situations, but that internal struggle of like what happens after that moment and what that means for your perspective on life and your path in life is probably really interesting to me, and that's probably why I keep returning to it.
I think that's beautifully said, because I think that's one of the things that I do find really interesting and profound with your work is that, like in this one, the legacy of kind of disappearances and loss are present at the beginning and reverberate through the book. It's not just the life and death stakes are not just the primary plot point, but they kind of are a prelude and kind of inform the actions of the characters going through. And I think that gives it a very interesting kind of meditative level to that and what our characters and what Riley's doing.
Well, thank you. And I do think since it's speculative, I got a little wish fulfillment in there at the end too.
That's good. That's one of the things literature should do for us.
That's right.
Pivoting a little bit from some of the plots and themes, I did want to talk a little bit about the title, No Beauties or Monsters, which is, I think, a wonderfully evocative title. I was very excited when I saw this come across my desk. And you've mentioned that this comes from the diary of a woman, Rosa Shanina.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but could you tell us a little bit about her and that line and how that came to be the title of the book?
Well, I'm glad you liked the title, because I think that's, well, for me, it's one of the harder things sometimes. And for this book at the time, it's a contemporary story, and there's no sort of World War II element to this book at all. So I just want to preface by saying that. But when I was writing it, I was just really interested in reading about female soldiers, women soldiers in World War II. And so I came across this diary, it's translated diary of a teenager, a Soviet soldier who was a sniper, and her name was Rosa Shanina, and she joined when her brothers were killed by German troops. So she like against all odds just signed up, right, and became very successful in what she did. But as you can imagine, her journal is like really heartbreaking. She's young, and then she doesn't survive the war. She dies in battle, but like there's a line in there, so it's just this gut-wrenching journal, and then there's a line in there about no beauties or monsters, and I just thought it just stuck with me. I mean, the whole journal stuck with me, but particularly that line. And so because it's kind of about the journal itself is about courage, and I think this book is about courage in some ways, but it's also like kind of asking, are we capable of doing beautiful things or monstrous ones? So I put it as the title, and then asked my editor as we were getting ready for a publication, like, should we stick with it? She's like, yeah, I think we should. And I think it's probably because it does sort of have that emotional resonance with the story.
Absolutely. And I agree, that sense of juxtaposing the beautiful and the monstrous, and those two pieces, and the kind of bold statement of no beauties or monsters, that this isn't necessarily going to swing into the sublime and the purely beautiful or into the purely monstrous, but trying to chart some path in the middle. But yeah, I think it's a great juxtaposition.
Yeah.
And so before we move into asking some questions kind of about your process as a writer, many of our attendees are writers themselves and very interested in the process. We do live in the age of the screen adaptation of books. And so I'm always curious to know, should this get picked up as an adaptation, do you have any dream casts, anyone that you're like, yeah, if you get to be the casting director, that you would just budget no option, get to pull in?
Well, I really do hope it does get picked up. And, as I was writing it, it just seemed like a very I was just picturing it, obviously, as we do. And I'm, when I look at some of the reviews, I've been really happy that a lot of people have agreed that they really like the Stranger Things comparison. And I loved that cast, especially in the first season. But I must admit that I do not follow actors very closely. So I would leave it to the experts, or I would ask readers, like, tell me who you think.
Well, if he does get picked up, which fingers crossed, we'll be looking for that social media poll for everybody to send in.
Yes, I like
Their
it.
dream cast.
Run it through the library.
Absolutely. Oh, fantastic. So moving out a little bit from No Beauties or Monsters into a bit of your process, how did you become a writer? What brought you here?
Well, that is actually a longer story than you might think. But no, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, I was a big reader when I was younger. I moved around, my family moved around a lot, just like Riley's family, actually. And so I used books sort of as my friends in these, we moved like every 2 years, and I just read everywhere. I read in the cafeteria and at recess, and it was just a way to, if you have a book there, you don't have to worry about making friends. And then people come up and ask you what you're reading. So it leads to conversations. So it worked really well for me. But anyway, I loved reading. I wanted to always be a writer because of that, because it had made such a big impact in my own life. So I did what writers tend to do when they're younger, if they're interested in writing. I wrote poetry and song lyrics in high school and started, novels, never finished them. But I didn't have any examples of writers in my life. All of my sort of the adults around me were very practical people. There weren't any artists or writers, working writers. So I just didn't know what that path would look like. And so when I went to college, I just did sort of like creative writing classes on the side for fun. And it wasn't until I was there where I saw the model of like the creative writing professor. So I was like, okay, I can go on and do more school and become a professor. And so I did do that route for a while, but it turns out that when you're doing that route, you're doing a lot of academic writing and you're teaching a lot, and it's taking a lot of time. So it's fun, but there isn't as much time as you might think to actually write. And while I was doing that, teaching and working on postgraduate degrees, I started interning actually at a publishing house. I was living in Australia at the time. And so there was a publishing house in Sydney who needed someone. So I started working, and then I got offered a job, and it was the best job I ever had. It was so much fun. So I was an editor there, and it was for an imprint of a traditional publishing house, but we were publishing mostly genre fiction, so mysteries and sci-fi and like all these things that I loved reading as a kid. And it just reminded me that I could write that way. I didn't have to write academic or sort of literary fiction, which is great, but this was sort of, it brought me back to my passion, I guess. And that's when I started writing those kind of books again. And I'm glad I did. It was a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. So that was really when you started writing for publication, it really was in kind of this thriller. Was it also in YA, or did you move into YA a little bit later in your process?
Yeah, I tended to. So up until that point, I had been publishing, because to do these sort of like postgraduate degrees, you end up, this is the way it was when I was there. Obviously, every school is different, but you're trying to publish a lot of essays, but you're also trying to publish short fiction. So I was doing a lot of short stories leading up to sort of finding my footing with novels and writing. Yeah, absolutely, writing mysteries and thrillers, because that's really what I've always wanted to, what I've always read. And so that's what I was drawn to writing as well. But that was kind of the moment where I fully embraced like trying to actually write a mystery thriller that you'd see on the shelves and get an agent, all those things.
Fantastic. And so now this is your second novel, No Beauties or Monsters. How was the publishing process and the writing process for this compared to your first one, The Breathless? Was it similar? Did things change a lot after you had a book out there that you've done promotion for? What was that like?
Yeah, I think that everyone talks about the second novel taking a lot more time, and I actually think with both novels they took me a while, because I tend to be an overwriter and a rewriter, and I don't think any of that is wasted time, because of course when you're writing and researching and coming up with ideas and like drafting, all of that is, you know, you getting to know the story better and getting to know your characters better. But yes, I would like to be eventually a faster outliner and then not like completely trash it as I go along. So far it's just been my process that I write something and then I end up rewriting it. Or like for both of these books, actually, so The Breathless has a really small cast, as I mentioned before. It's very contained. It's basically about one family, whereas No Beauties or Monsters has a really large cast, because again, I had that sort of TV series idea in my head as I was writing it. But both times I put in a lot of different point of views. So then I had to go back and just take a lot of those, strip them back. So with No Beauties, you initially there were points of view chapters with different points of view, and now it's just all from Riley. So yeah.
So you mentioned that, you take a lot of time with it. About how long does it take you to put one of these books together?
I mean, I think a while. I feel like I am the type of writer who loves research and outlining and coming up with those really cool, scenes that you would imagine in a movie trailer, for example. So like I absolutely adore that stage. And then, drafting, I've done it both ways, where you're doing a really quick draft and then you come back and really find your voice and fill in the details. But I've also tried like, a draft that you're kind of revising as you go along, as if you were going to show, someone like a reader as to get feedback and that sort of thing. But yeah, so both of them have taken a while. I would say not so much to write the first stage of the book, but the rewriting took a while. So I did rewrite both stories. So it was kind of like writing 4 novels instead. Yeah. So I'm working on that, working on streamlining the process.
Absolutely. But, I've heard it said there's no good writing, only good editing, only good rewriting. That's part of the process.
That's true, right? Yeah.
So you mentioned that you love research. You've mentioned setting before, but where do you get your ideas for these stories, and what kind of comes to you first? Is it setting, or do you find your characters? Is it the twist or the plot? Has it varied between your works? Where do you kind of get the core of these?
I would say definitely for me it is, and maybe it's because I moved around a lot, but it's definitely setting, place, that sense that every place has, that kind of gets you interested in a particular setting, and then you start to read about it or learn more about it, and there's just so much to draw from, I think. And so because I write mystery thrillers, it's usually, a situation is tied to a specific place, and then I kind of go from there.
Nice. I know you mentioned for No Beauties or Monsters that was one of those, was your road trip down into Mojave and getting that sense of that place. So you mentioned that you do the rewriting. Does your rewriting tend to change the plot, or does it tend to change more of your language, or does kind of the whole thing just get a second birth after walking through it one time?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me the rewriting is just a way of finding like the, because okay, let me reframe that. When you're talking about a story, it's easy to think about the plot, right? And especially a thriller, you kind of have an idea of what needs to happen in a thriller and what you want to feel at the end. But then it's sort of layering the character arc as well, right? So that's the second sort of part to it. So if you just thought about plot, it would feel very flimsy. So a lot of times for me, it's more just a discovery, like a process of discovery with the character and the character arcs. So the plot might not necessarily change too much, but it's just getting deeper in every chapter. So you're really immersing yourself in the character and figuring out sort of how they see the world and what they're thinking and feeling in those big moments.
I think that's a really beautiful way to describe that, because yeah, sometimes, if you describe plot, well, okay, if you have puppet characters who move through those beats, it's not as compelling. It's who do these characters become as they move through those.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's probably why I rewrite, because you have this outline in mind, but when you are actually in there and you're writing the story, things can shift because you realize like, oh no, this character wouldn't react in that way that you had initially thought she might, or he might.
Absolutely. And so do you find that they really surprise you over the course of the rewrite? Do your characters kind of become fully fleshed and do some things that perhaps surprise you or you didn't want them to when you first plotted them out?
That would be interesting if that happens. I think I love it when authors say like the character took over. I'm like, really? Like, what does that look like? Like that's amazing. But for me, it's more, I guess what's happened with me is more like you're writing sort of this cast, and then you have like a character that you didn't think would be in the story as much, just want to sort of be in there more. So that sort of happened. But no, but they don't really take over in a sense that I'm like, oh well, tell me more character, something like that. So
Absolutely. But you do get that better sense as you spend more time
yes.
with them and in their heads of how they interact through the story and how to make that more meaningful.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. So with that, with going through and getting that published, one of the things that is, I think, absolutely gorgeous about this book is your cover art, which also Jack Hughes is the artist for it. And he had a couple different preliminary ideas that he shared on Twitter and that we have to share as well. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how covers get chosen. I mean, there's such a part of picking something up off of the shelf, choosing to read something, despite the fact we're never supposed to judge a book by the cover. But how much involvement did you have in this process? How did this come to be?
Well, I think with traditional publishing, at least in my experience with these two novels, and also just as when I was working as an editor in a publishing house, the author doesn't tend to be involved, and obviously there are exceptions, but like with The Breathless, I didn't have any say in the cover art at all. And when I was working as an editor, it was sort of a conversation between the editor and the publisher and the marketing team, right? Like what cover would best represent this book, and like what are the comparison covers that you're trying to sort of aim for. But with No Beauties, I had a fairly new editor, and I don't know if that's why she included me in the process, but I did get to see the sketches. And when I found out, that she was hiring an illustrator for it, I was really excited because I love illustrated covers. And then, when I started looking at Jack Hughes' work, I was even more excited because I think he's pretty phenomenal. And then she started showing me these sketches. It was probably the most fun of this whole publishing process, was that those kind of early moments where I got to see what another creative thought and sort of their take on the story, and what what they turned that into, because I'm not an artist myself. So I think all of his sketches would have worked for different reasons, but I'm really so happy with what we settled on, because I think it represents the story the best. Like if you look at the cover and you're intrigued, you're probably going to like the book, right? Like if you see anything you don't like about it, Yep. So I really was so happy that we got to see what he could do with
That's fantastic. We've got quite a few questions in our question and answer. So I've got a couple other little questions for you, but I think I want to go through and answer some of the questions from our attendees to make sure that we have time for all of those, if that works for you.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions, you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier that you have been reading the reviews of this book, and one of our attendees is wondering, one, if you read them, which it sounds like you do, but how they affect you and whether you find that they influence what you're writing next or anything like that.
Yes. Well, actually, I should say, especially for all the writers out there, it's not the best to read your reviews. I mean, it is fun to occasionally look at them. And obviously you see them if you're tagged in a review online or that sort of thing. If a blogger reviews it, like those are sort of reviews that I tend to see just because I'm tagged on social media. But like if I love reviews, right? Because they're authors couldn't do it without librarians, and we couldn't do it without bloggers, and we couldn't do it without readers. Like those reviews are what help spread the word. And so I do appreciate them, especially when you can tell someone's read the book and they're not just commenting on the cover or something. But yeah, I do tend to read some of them, but I try not to, because obviously, you know, especially if you're a writer who takes in feedback, you know, you don't necessarily want to see all of that specific feedback. Like it's a good idea to have a general sense of things here and there, but dwelling on reviews probably would be unhealthy. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and similar to kind of what you're saying in terms of managing the kind of feedback you get from it, we've got a couple questions asking about, do you let anyone read your drafts, like family or friends, besides your editors? Like, is there anyone who gets to see the early work before it goes to your editors or anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's pretty important to have feedback from people that you trust. You know, so I have some writer friends that I would always share a draft with, you know, first before handing it into my editor, if I had the luxury of time. I mean, I have a writer friend here who was just saying how they hadn't even had a chance to read. They were such on a tight deadline that they didn't even have a chance to reread their book before sending it to their editor. And so it's nice when you have enough time to share it with people that you trust and get that feedback as you go along. But I think every writer is different. You know, I've heard some writers don't like to share their work. You know, maybe it's too early to share and you don't want to be influenced because you're not quite you know, steady on your own legs with the draft. And then some people, you know, might not want to share their work because they've been doing it a while and they have a really strong sense of what they have to accomplish anyhow. So that they don't have time for that extra round of getting other people to read. But I personally do like to have some friends read it if I have time.
And so it sounds like the people that you have read it are writers themselves. Do you ever let anybody who's doesn't know what it is to write a book get to see an early draft, or do they get to see it later?
Yes, because those are generally readers that I trust. And I think, you know, sometimes that's even more helpful, right? Like just having someone who's a big reader read your book. You know, writers sometimes can get, like, I know myself, I can like get lost in the forest, right? Like not see the forest, the trees. And so sometimes you just want a good reader to just say, hey, you know what? If I had picked this up, here's what I would tell you. You know?
Absolutely. We've got a couple questions specific on a few of your books. We do have one on who is your favorite character to write in No Beauties?
Definitely one of the brothers, both brothers, actually. I wouldn't, and that might be because I have two brothers. So like maybe I'm sort of thinking about them as I answer. But yeah, Kai, the stepbrother, was probably my favorite character to write. And he's probably an example of a character who sort of, you know, came into his own and sort of like had these personality traits that I didn't necessarily imagine right away. And so I had a lot of fun writing both of Riley's brothers.
Fantastic. Yeah, they're great. They're great characters. This one also has a brother. I appreciate them very much.
Oh yes, good.
And then another one is actually about your first novel, The Breathless. And our attendees mentioning that in that book, the house is almost an additional character. And that it's very, very vividly described both inside and out. And we're wondering whether there's a house if there's a real house that inspired it in your memory.
Well, thank you to whoever thinks it's described well. And I think, no, for that particular house, it was more just a compilation of houses that I had run across and stories I had heard growing up. In particular, I remember, you know, being really young and I guess everyone probably has this experience, but where there was this dilapidated house, you know, nearby that clearly probably been burned or something like that. And and it was left standing, and so the urban legends were surrounding it, kids whispering about what really happened there, and so I think that's probably where my interest. I've just always loved the idea of I love old houses, I love abandoned houses, and I love the sort of ghost stories that tend to go with those kind of places.
I love what you mentioned there with the stories that kids tell, because, when we talk about places, and, you and I talked about this earlier this evening with the Mojave, there's kind of the level of folklore that kind of gets passed down. And if people do oral histories of a place, that's what gets written down. But there's also just the folklore of the kids in the neighborhood. And I too had the experience of there being, the house or the creepy place in your neighborhood, and somebody 2 grades above you knows for sure what happened, and they'll let you know. And sometimes that's very different from kind of the greater regional folklore that's in that place. But I think it'd be really telling for who's growing up there.
And kids have probably the most interesting imaginations of all of us. So yes, those stories are very interesting to listen to.
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of questions about your process. One of which is, when and where do you write? And is that daily? Is it in spurts? What does your kind of writing practice look like?
Yeah, it definitely used to be. Well, I don't know that it's ever been daily, but I'm trying to work toward a daily process, and that obviously has changed over the years. Jobs have changed. I have 2 small toddlers now, so that's changed a little bit. And but I would say when I write the best, it's when I'm writing daily and when I'm fully immersed in the story. Even if that's you just have a little bit of time that you've picked, 5 a.m. every day, where you're spending time with the story, either thinking about it or drafting it. I just find you find your rhythm that way. And I don't have the best memory. So for me, if I'm writing in spurts, there's a lot of time lost, because you end up coming back to a story, trying to get into it again, remembering what you put down before, did I mention that clue or not? These things that can slip your mind in the early stages of a draft. So yes, I actually had the best experience writing when I went on a writing retreat with a friend when I was doing my postgraduate work, where I had this 6-week chunk of time, and she was a teacher as well. So she had the same thing, where we went to Indonesia and went on this writing retreat and wrote for 6 hours a day, or no, it was probably more 12 hours a day, right? Where we're doing nothing but writing. And it was just the most incredible experience, just getting really far into the drafts, but also, it was just an interesting time because we were both writing mysteries, all these strange things started happening, bats were swarming us and things like that. So they started to go into the story. So I definitely think it does help if you can come up with some sort of ritual or daily practice, even if it's, 10 minutes long. So
I think your point about memory is a really good one. That's always been one of the things I've been most impressed with all of our authors who write mysteries and thrillers, is being able to keep track of all the clues and the characters and who knows what when. And I can see how, if you're stepping away from that for a couple weeks or a couple months, that can be very hard to hold all of that. And
oh yes, good thing there's Scrivener and programs like that help you out a little bit.
And then we have another one. I know you spoke a little about this with place and setting, about getting inspired and getting ideas, but also, do you struggle with writer's block, and do you have any kind of tricks for getting through that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, when I think of writer's block, I think sometimes it's those moments where I'm just turning my wheels, stuck in a scene that I know I have to, or a part of the story that I thought that I knew what was happening, but now I don't know what's happening, and it's kind of come to a grinding halt. And in those moments, I've really realized that there's something inherently wrong with what I've planned, and that I need to remember, what I really love about this particular moment or scene or story, and sort of bring back that playfulness, I think, and let something new transpire. So maybe I've come to a halt because it's not quite right. And my subconscious knows that. And it's just a matter of kind of having fun with it again and playing around and not taking yourself so seriously. But there's another type of writer's block, which we think of, which is, I think, sometimes when you're not sure what to write, right? Where you don't have an idea, maybe. And that doesn't usually happen to me. I usually have too many ideas and then I have to narrow them down. But it is hard, I think, to pick, what is the best idea among an array of half-formed ideas? Like, what should I spend my time on trying to develop? And I think that's also when you ask yourself, like, you can't predict what people are going to like, and you can't predict what the market wants. So you might as well just go back to the basics and like, what excites you the most? What are you most intrigued by? And do that thing, and then hope that it sort of, translates into an audience, right? Also liking that element.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a great statement that, you can't, I think this is one of the hard things with reviews too, is not everyone is going to like everything, even if it's perfectly written and exactly what it should be. And that's great. That's why we have so much fantastic literature to read, even though it can be heartbreaking when someone lets you know that what you labored over is in fact not what they like reading.
Yeah.
But I think passion is contagious, and I like all of your language about having fun and remembering that, writing is work, but it can also be joy, and be sustaining in that way. We do have someone who's wondering, is there a writer that you wish you could have a conversation with because you love their work or are so inspired by them?
Ooh, that is a really, wow. Yes. I don't think I could have a conversation with my main choices because they are no longer with us, but I think I would have loved.
It'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just thinking of the writers that probably informed or sort of changed my world the most, like when I was younger, and I loved Toni Morrison's Beloved. I just think there's probably not a better book that's ever been written. And then Shirley Jackson, anything Shirley Jackson. I probably would have loved talking to Shirley Jackson and just getting inside of her head. She is like, very speculative writer, and just, really forged the ground for a lot of subsequent novels, right? So many people are sort of inspired by her work. So it'd be really interesting to have a conversation with her.
Absolutely. Yeah, Shirley Jackson's fantastic. So we are coming up to the end of the hour. So we've got a number of questions still in the Q&A that I'm going to try to kind of summarize to the heart of them, because most of them are about, for new writers, particularly writers who are trying to get published for the first time. What advice do you have on getting published, on dealing with rejection, on moving forward through that? Because you have gotten 2 books successfully published.
Ooh, there's a lot to say, and I don't want to be long-winded if we've got a lot of questions remaining. I think my biggest piece of advice is really write. If you're trying to be a novelist, write your novel. Don't stop and restart or throw it away because you don't think it's good enough. Because every single writer, I don't know anyone who doesn't. Well, maybe there are a few people who have gotten to the point where they're like, I know this is good, but like there's, every writer goes through that process where like, this is fun. Wait, this isn't fun. I have to redo the whole thing. No, I should keep going. And until you get to the end, you're never going to have anything to even work with. Right. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice is really just, don't, if this is what you want, just get to that ending. And maybe it's not the book that you publish, and maybe it needs lots of writing and rewriting or whatever, but at least you're there. You got to the 100% mark, right? You got past the finish line. That's the one thing I would say is important when you're considering this career as a novelist. And the other thing is to remember, and I don't know what stage everyone is in the process, but just remember that the publishing industry, well, it's a fickle industry, but also everybody's human, right? Like until I worked in publishing, I think I tended to put agents and editors on pedestals because like, wow, you really want this thing. And just as we were talking about how kids look up to adults, you realize that people are just people, right? And so someone might have had a bad day when they read your book, and that's why they rejected you. It had nothing to do with you, So I think it's just remembering that everybody's human, and timing goes into it as well.
Absolutely. Just having that perseverance in the face, because
Yes.
if you don't send it out, it won't get picked up. So
Right. Yeah. And to know that it's a process for everyone, even the writers have been writing for, put their 10,000 hours in or whatever, it's always a process.
absolutely. Well, and with that, we've just got 5 minutes and we do want to do the drawing for the book, but thank you
Yay.
so much, Tara. This has been fantastic. Your novel is fantastic. I'm very excited to read The Breathless. I've not had a chance to at this point, but it has been such a delight talking with you this evening. And I hope our attendees have gotten some great things to think about with your book and with writing and working with identity and loss and thrillers in the world today. So
well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I do hope you know how much librarians mean to authors. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And with that, so as I said, we do have 2 of these copies. I do have in front of me a list of attendees, and we are going to use a random number generator to make sure that this is completely random on who these copies go to. And once this goes through, you will be able to pick them up at the front desk of the library. We'll keep them up there for just about 2 weeks. So please do try to come in and see us within 2 weeks to pick those up at the front desk. But our first winner is Gabriel Copens. So congratulations. And then it makes me the same number. And our next one is going to be Rita McPeak. Fantastic. All right. Congratulations to those winners. And again, come pick those up at the front desk of the Lincoln Public Library in the next 2 weeks. And Tara, thank you again. And best of luck with your next adventures with promoting this book. And we can't wait to see the next one you put out.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who listened in.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.